Whether you have way too many clamps, or you're just getting started on your clamp hoarding journey, if you don't have a good storage system, you're gonna waste tons of time moving clamps all over the shop and digging around to find the ones you need. Found you. I remember this clamp rack that April Wilkerson built a few years ago, but I think we can improve on it. I'm pretty sure we can pack the clamps in just a bit tighter. We'll come back to that a little later. But the biggest issue? Her design is just way too big to easily move through my shop. So I set out to build the best clamp storage system I could. And the best part is you can knock this out in a weekend. I've even got plans to guide you through every cut. Now, every shop is different, but there's one basic rule that's universal to organization and efficiency, and that is, if it ain't easy, it won't work. Take my setup for example. I really wanted to build a wall-mounted solution because right here I have 3 surfaces that are perfect for hanging clamps. But here's the problem. Unless I was only ever doing glue-ups at this one bench, I would just waste way too much time carrying clamps back and forth. So the next logical choice is a mobile cart. Now this area right here is still going to be the best spot to store the cart in between glue-ups. It's right at 2 feet deep and comes in just a little bit over 4 feet wide. So that'll be perfect to give me a little bit of extra space. But the problem is that this bench right here, it's only 3 feet from the wall. That was awkward. And that just won't give me enough room to move the cart out. So that means that my cart needs to be even smaller. But maybe that'll work in our favor. To kick off this build, I first cross-cut the plywood with my ACS to make it easier to handle and rip down the remaining pieces of plywood at the table saw. I rarely use a cart in the shop to help feed material at the table saw, but it really made handling large sheets of plywood at the saw easier. And as an added bonus, it gave me a spot to stack everything once the pieces were cut down to size. As you probably guessed, I'll be adding casters to this cart, and once I mark where I need to drill the mounting holes, I head over to the drill press to quickly knock them out before attaching the bottom panel. I decided to go with pocket hole joinery for this project because it's dead simple and plenty strong. So my normal go-to when I have a bunch of pocket holes to knock out is my Kreg Foreman. But in all honesty, it would have been much easier to just use the Kreg 520 rather than having to balance these big pieces on 2 Foremans. It ended up working just fine, but for some reason, I had it in my head that I was going to use the Foreman, so I hope you enjoyed my rather clumsy way of making this work. To maximize space for hanging clamps and to make it more stable once it's all loaded up, I'm going to put the board that everything will hang on in the center, and that'll conveniently make this clamp cart double-sided and give me more flexibility with how I lay out the clamps. If you've ever run a screw into a pocket hole joint without the piece being clamped together really well, like say in the middle of a piece of plywood, like I'm doing right here, you've probably had it bow away from you. Since I didn't have a great way to clamp the center of these boards, I grabbed a long scrap, set it against the edge of the piece I'm screwing down, and clamped it in place. This way, the center board stays right where it needs to and doesn't end up with a huge bow in the middle of it. To secure the top and bottom to the cart, a couple of these right angle clamps from Kreg are really handy. You could creatively arrange a few trigger clamps to do this, but the right angle clamps are a lot faster. So with the center 3 screws in, I remove the right angle clamp to add the last 2 screws. But sometimes the pieces won't line up perfectly if the plywood has a bow. So I just grab a trigger clamp and switch around the end to turn the clamp into a spreader before running in those last 2 screws. At this point, you can see the cart is pretty flimsy as I'm flipping it over, but just taking it easy, I didn't have any issues. And now I can run the remaining screws into the top and bottom to make this cart nice and stable. You might be wondering why I have the pocket holes facing outward instead of to the inside to keep things cleaner. Since I'm using a cheaper plywood for these cabinets, it's actually stronger this way. Since pocket hole screws go in at an angle, if you face those pocket holes to the inside when you're using lower grade plywood, sometimes those center plies can delaminate or bulge outward, which weakens the joint. By facing the pocket holes outward, you'll create a more stable joint that holds up better over time. However, if I were using Baltic birch or a nice cabinet grade plywood that doesn't have internal voids, the orientation wouldn't matter as much. But with this stuff, the orientation does make a difference. With that done and the bottom screwed on, I'm ready to add the casters. I really like these locking casters from Kreg because they roll easily, have a 600-pound capacity, and they're quiet. So many casters are made from hard plastic and they're just obnoxiously loud. But I love these casters so much I have them on almost all of my mobile carts and tools in the shop. Anyways, with the casters on, I just need to add these bottom pieces. They give the cart a bit more rigidity and will also make storing small accessories or funky shaped clamps a little easier. With the cart built, now it's time to tackle getting all of our clamps organized, and most of them are going to hang on supports that look like this. They aren't terribly complex to cut out. You're basically starting with a rectangle and then cutting from corner to corner to make your triangular hangers. But if you want to copy the dimensions I found that work well for hanging a variety of clamps, grab the plans that are linked above and in the description to take the guesswork out of your build. Once all the hangers are cut, it's time for more pocket holes. I think you could probably get away with just 2 in each hanger, but the idea of having 3 screws made me feel a bit better just knowing how heavy clamps can get. Now the real secret sauce to making the clamps hang nicely and not all cattywampus is to put a cap on top of the hanger. This allows the jaws of the clamp to act as a resting point and also keeps them from swinging side to side when you're rolling the cart. The size of this cap is largely determined by the style of clamp you're hanging, but we'll dive into that here in just a bit. Before I start tossing clamps onto the carts, I take a minute to think through which clamps I actually use together most often. My goal is to set things up so that I can roll out just one cart for most projects instead of always having to drag out both. When I'm gluing up tabletops, I'm almost always only grabbing my K-body Revos. But when I'm assembling things like a table base, I found that I'm always grabbing F-clamps and trigger clamps. So with that in mind, I set up one cart to store all of my parallel clamps and the other one to store everything else. Whether you're optimizing a clamp cart to hold as much as possible or packing a Corolla for a family trip, you know one thing holds true. You gotta start with the biggest items first. So with that, I figured out the spacing for my hangers and get the first row installed. For parallel clamps, you need 2 hangers for each set of clamps. One hanger supports the main portion of the jaw and the second supports the small amount on the back. Obviously, I put these as high up as possible while still giving myself a little bit of clearance. Also, here's a tip that'll make your life easier. If you ended up drilling all of your pocket holes on the right side of your supports, work from left to right. If not, then work from right to left. This will give you as much room as possible while you're installing those hangers. While this is a great start, obviously we can use all this dead space down here at the bottom and just lean some clamps against the cabinet. But since they're not hanging, they could tip out of the cart while I'm rolling it through the shop. And that, my friends, would not be good. Pre-drill and install 2 screws into the edge of the cart, just a little bit lower than the end of each clamp's bar. Then cut a piece of plywood the width of the cart and add some notches to each end that'll slide over the screws you just installed. Now you can simply slide this piece off the screws when you need to get clamps, and then put it back in position when you're ready to roll the cart. With the biggest clamps organized, figuring out where to put the rest of your clamps really just comes down to holding up the clamp in the leftover space and seeing what fits best where. But at this point, I actually didn't finish optimizing my cart with all the parallel clamps. Instead, I got started on a second cart that will store all of my trigger clamps and F-clamps. This way, I have as much space as possible to store all of those clamps on just one cart. Because remember, I want to be able to bring out just one cart for a project instead of always having to drag out both. Even though hanging these clamps is pretty similar to what we've already done, I want to take a quick moment and just share with you what I found works best for hanging these and other styles of clamps. Depending on what size and style of trigger clamps you have, you may or may not need a top cap for your hangers, but figuring that out is really simple. If the gap between the bar and the clamping pad is much more than about 3/4 of an inch, go ahead and plan on adding a cap to the top of your hanger. So for example, the Bessey EHK XL clamp will hang just fine without a cap. But the EHKL and the EHKM do need a cap because otherwise they would hang at an angle and the cart wouldn't be quite as well organized. But if you only have a couple of each size and you don't want to dedicate an entire hanger to just 2 or 3 clamps, do this instead. Cut a notch in the cap toward the front so that way you can store 2 different size clamps on the same hanger. So now let's take a look at F-clamps and some of the accessories that can go with them. All of my F-style clamps have caps on them, and they're generally on the heavier side. So I opted to use 2 hangers to store most of them. Figuring out what size the caps need to be for your F-clamps is about the same as it was for the trigger clamps. So just measure the gap between the bar and the pad, and then when you cut the cap, cut it about 1/8 of an inch smaller. This will give you just enough clearance so that you can easily set the clamp onto the hanger or take it off without it binding. I have a couple of these edge clamp accessories for my F-style clamps, and they simply slip onto the bar and they add clamping pressure 90 degrees to the bar. But as you can see, the notch right here is way too small to fit onto one of our standard hangers. So I went over to the table saw, cut a notch in the top of one of the hangers, so that way my edge clamps will sit just fine. If you have some lighter clamps that might be prone to sliding around on the hanger, like the click clamp, or maybe you just want some more peace of mind that they won't fall off while you're moving the cart, glue a scrap to the end of your hanger like this. You probably have some clamps that are too small to fit on the hangers, but there's no sense in giving up now and just piling them in the bottom of the cart. For those clamps, grab a small wall control panel like this, along with some of their hooks, so that way you can give those small clamps a dedicated spot. Also, just a quick aside, because it really ties into our topic of organization with this video, if you've never heard of wall control, it's metal pegboard. I have it all over the shop in different areas to keep myself organized at places like the laser, the miter saw bench, and even to hold a couple of dust collection accessories. Wall Control didn't sponsor this video, but if you're interested in their products and want to add them to your shop, you can use my code WOODSHOPMIC at checkout to save 5% off of your order. But what do you do with clamps and accessories that just don't make sense to put on a hanger? Well, on this cart with the parallel clamps, I don't really have any space left to hang more items, like these extenders that allow me to join two parallel clamps together, and these pivoting jaws that make gluing up angled pieces way easier, along with a handful of other accessories that I commonly use with my parallel clamps. Here on the trigger clamp cart, I do still have some additional room on the back to hang a few more clamps. But after thinking through it for a bit, my best bet is again going to be utilizing that area on the bottom for these last few items. So I've got a couple of clamps here that still need a home. I have two versions of Bessie's edge clamps. I have a box of spring clamps from when I was in high school, and yeah, this is still the same original box, along with miscellaneous mounting hardware for this vise and a couple of other accessories. Now with all this, there's no way I have clamps that are anywhere else in the shop, right? Not exactly. While these carts have dramatically improved my clamp storage, I want to let you in on a little secret. The vast majority of the time, our clamps belong on racks like these. But there are instances where having dedicated clamps at a specific workstation just makes the most sense. For example, these T-track clamps are used exclusively at this workbench, so it only makes sense that they would stay right here. And at this bench, all of my dog hole clamps are close at hand whenever I need them. But let's say you have an inordinate amount of clamps, and the only way you can think to store them is just piling them in a box. Well, don't overthink it. Just put them in a box, and when you don't need them, tuck them away, but not on the floor. We just spent all day building 2 carts to keep you from putting stuff on the floor. So now it's your turn. Go grab the plans and get your clamps organized.